I'm a rocket geek. I've been doing this a long time. I started my career with NASA back in 1989, working on the space shuttle program. We've got commercial rockets, commercial satellites, OTVs, or orbital transfer vehicles, ways to deliver things to the moon, but they're all using government ranges. Clearly, we've got to move away from government ranges to build a true vertical that includes the range, the vehicle, the satellites, the transfers, the space stations in orbit, that builds that entire vertical. Finding those places are going to be pretty hard, and that's something I think is pretty unique about what we're offering.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey, space enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode. My guest today is Steve Martier, and he's the president and CEO of Maritime Launch Services in Canada. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Steve, the way we usually kick off this type of episode is by me asking you for the elevator pitch on Maritime Launch Services, please.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. I really kind of have to take a step back where we are today, and that way the elevator speech really fits well into the discussion. But I look at this space economy, which is now $600 billion US per year and headed for $1 trillion plus in the next 5 to 10 years on an annual basis, is really having started, when the last space shuttle landed in 2011. That space economy really started to grow at that point, and it's really about a lot of services being provided and these satellites that are being developed, all the technology that's being developed and delivered into orbit to provide those, Starlink and global broadband near Earth imaging, those kinds of things that are important today, monitoring for climate change, et cetera. And that's just going apace. And at the base of it, though, is you've got satellites made on Earth, and they have to get into orbit. These economies can't work otherwise. I was engaged to bring this project forward by doing a study about 8 years ago, looking for a location in North America that could serve where the market is going, where these satellites want to be in orbit. Of course, that's changed, right? They're no longer the geo deep space kinds of satellites. They're now LEO, low Earth orbit, 1,000 kilometers of altitude, and constellations, in other words, groupings of satellites that are all continuously, flowing around the Earth and internet, networking together. And so I found this, did this study and found this location in North America here in Nova Scotia, on the tip of the peninsula out near a town named Canso. And the people there, when I first met with them for an open house, asked why Canso. And they described the community as not the end of the earth, but you can see it from there. And I said, what better place do you want to build a spaceport at? Because we have nothing but open ocean all the way down to South America, all the way over to Africa and over to Europe. It's that massive expanse of ocean that you want to launch your vehicles over, and then putting these satellites into orbit in those directions that the clients want. So that's a real genesis of where things got started here, is really trying to find that sweet spot and finding a coastal community anywhere in North America where, frankly, most of the satellites on Earth are made, that can really beat some of the logistics some of these other places that are trying to up and come can provide, really made sense for us. So that's kind of where we got started. I dove in, found an investor, opened up the company, and started on the environmental reviews, taking us to that point. And it's really about servicing that massive market demand.
So I'm going to come back and to some of these, let's say, criteria you mentioned there in a minute.
Sure.
But just taking a step back. So I guess on the most basic level here, because there's obviously existing spaceports, like in the US we have, I think probably all of our listeners know about Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. Many of them will know about places like Vandenberg, which are very busy places, thanks substantially to SpaceX. But so I guess you and your team thought, well, that's not enough. right? We basically we need other locations.
Well, yeah, indeed. Well, Kennedy Space Center, they in Cape Canaveral, the Air Force team down there, they actually have a letter they produced saying they need additional capability. Florida's launching almost one a week out of Cape Canaveral Air Force Station or Space Launch Base or whatever it's called these days, and Vandenberg is the other one on the West Coast that's servicing the market. They've got a launch tempo as well, but they're government ranges. They're mostly serving government customers, except for SpaceX is servicing their own Starlink, of course, but they've taken up all the bandwidth, right? So there's a couple of aspects of that ability in North America to service this growing demand is what that opportunity is, I think.
And so just sort of expanding those a little bit further. And so you're saying these places are well used, launching once a week. But I guess so the simple question would be like, okay, we can't just build more pads, right? Because sort of the first assumption would be, oh, why don't we try to expand those places? Because I guess, and I will ask you in a few minutes, like the other type of infrastructure that we need, and I'm assuming this is, but you will tell me stuff like, propellant farms, mission control centers, a port where you can bring stuff, like rocket boosters and satellites. Like we have all of this infrastructure already at the existing spaceports. So of course, it seems like there's a certain type of effort required to establish a new spaceport. Am I thinking about this correctly?
You are indeed. And they have taken steps to try to expand what they're doing in Florida as well. But here's the push and the pull on that. The air traffic people that are trying to put aircraft up and down the coast and across the eastern seaboard, they're getting a little anxious about all this launch traffic that's going through and disrupting their stuff. The waterways, you have to have coordination with the Coast Guard and clearing a water track underneath the launch vehicle as well. So now you're clearing boat traffic, you're clearing air traffic, and you're locking up all this airspace for these rockets that are going more and more and more. So there's a real push and pull going on about the other stuff that's been going on, being able to handle more of that. They've gotten creative. They're looking at ways where they can clear an airspace as the rocket's flying and open it as it's passing, kind of thing. They're trying to be as creative as they can, but at the end of the day, more facilities and everything else, it's just a huge population center. And the other piece for Florida is they can't get to a sun-synchronous orbit or a polar type orbit. Because at the end of the day, you can't overfly millions of people with a rocket. There's a requirement to have less than a 1 in a million chance that somebody on the ground can get injured or killed as a rocket is taking off. So there's limited ranges of launch direction, trajectory, inclination that they can do from there that we can do more of up in Nova Scotia.
Okay, so with some of these criteria in mind, I think this is really sort of probably very educational for our listeners. Do you mind if you systematically run through some of the criteria you mentioned and maybe sort of then explain how your current location ticks these boxes? And by the way, can you give us a little bit more detail? Because I'm not going to assume that all of our listeners know the geography of Canada super well, like where exactly the spaceport is located.
Yeah, so if you go to Google Earth and you look in the tip of North America and you find Nova Scotia, there's the peninsula of Nova Scotia, and above it is the island of Cape Breton. Cape Breton is separate from the peninsula. So we're on the main peninsula. If you go to the tip of the peninsula and head furthest east to the ocean, there's a community, a town called Canso, another one, Hazel Hill, and Little Dover, kind of nested around where we are. There's a 2,400 acre parcel of land there that's owned by the province of Nova Scotia, and we're leasing 335 acres of it for 40 years. So that's the specific location of it. So, I'm a rocket geek. I've been doing this a long time. I started with my career with NASA back in 1989, working on the space shuttle program. So, I know what one has to do. And I worked at a rocket factory in New Mexico, working with the space shuttle orbital maneuvering engines, reaction control engines, building teams, operating facilities like that. So it was a part of the space shuttle program. So I knew what I needed to do to validate this site first and foremost. First is doing a ground safety analysis, right? Looking at the kind of buffer you have from the general public, the direction you're flying, what the safety aspects of that are. And there's really a lot out there that is available to help you do that evaluation. So we're plenty far away from the community. And then the flight safety analysis. Okay, you're going to launch on a trajectory, but that flight path, right, is just the planned path. What if it goes a little left or a little right on its trajectory? You've got to account for that in your analysis, that there may be some skew to the direction the rocket is going, and count the belly buttons underneath that whole corridor instead of just a trajectory, if you follow. Right, so it's we're going to try to follow the white lines down the highway, but there is still a road left and right, and that road expands as you head on further away. So you have to do that flight safety analysis and make sure that the site is going to be viable for any sort of mission that happens if there's a plus or minus to the direction that it's launching. So that was kind of how we kicked the thing out, how I, as an engineer, kicked the thing off to begin with. And it was at that point sharing that with the community, holding the open houses, building that social license really to get the support first from the community, the lobster fishermen, their term, fisherwomen, the municipality, the province, and then the federal government. And they've been genuinely very supportive of us because we did it as a grassroots from the ground up.
Okay, so just expanding on some of these. So on ground safety, I can't help asking. So probably many people, including myself in the past, would have like heard ground safety and sort of assume what you were referring to a few times already, sort of like population centers and safety of humans. Mm-hmm. Now, as I'm sure you've probably also seen, Elon keeps throwing around an anecdote how I think it was in Vandenberg, I think it was there, where they had to kidnap a seal, put headphones on it, and play booster sounds. Well, basically the point here being that it's not only humans, you have to care about wildlife as well. How are the environmental aspects you encountered?
Yeah, that sounds like him for sure. And frankly, these places that spaceports are built, Florida included, is part of a national wildlife refuge. So they tend to find places where there's no people on purpose, and those happen to be places that are wildlife refuges or have species that are endangered, or the birds out in Vandenberg that nest on the beach or whatever it is. So that's very true. And we went through an extremely rigorous process here to get through that environmental assessment and review with the province of Nova Scotia. We did 65 different bird studies, looking at everything that you can imagine about any affected animals and birds, etc. So the upshot is there are no endangered species anywhere around us, which is really convenient. The place we're building it is nothing but granite and it's scrub. There's no major trees or forests or anything that have to be taken down. It's not a real pristine piece of land that is a place where people want to build condominiums either, right? So as it turned out, it was really a good spot for us. And it's actually adjacent to a wind farm that was put in place near the town of Canso, which is also helpful in that whole environmental aspect of being able to get power locally as well.
Okay, so I now the last thing you mentioned with the wind farms, I have to ask, and maybe I'm showing my sort of engineering sort of lack of proficiency, but wind farm would imply sort of constant and possibly quite strong winds. Is that not interfere with operations, or is the weather generally
heavy crosswind? Definitely heavy crosswinds are a problem, yes, but generally speaking, we have well over 150, 175 days per year of clear skies and calm winds. The way I look at it is, yes, if the wind farm is having a really good day, we probably wouldn't launch that day for sure. But it's a good barometer in a sense too.
Yeah. Okay, so if we go back to sort of our list of I guess requirements and infrastructure. Okay, so you found a place that's because of geography has access to some of the interesting orbits you mentioned, like the polar orbits. You're near a lot of water. You are far away from population centers, wildlife. Okay. What else do we need? I was thinking before, yeah, probably airstrip, port, this type of thing.
Bingo, it's the infrastructure. That was part of that study I did. There was a dozen different aspects that I looked at. So as it happens, we've got the town of Canso has a deep sea port. So it's a kilometer from our front gate. To get on the entrance to the facility, there's a super port just down the road from us. There's two international airports. The major one in Halifax is 3 hours away, and another one in Port Hawkesbury for the golfers that fly into Cape Breton from the States on a regular basis. That is about an hour and a half away. There is rail fairly close by. There's transnational highway that runs very close by as well. So from a logistics perspective, it really check a lot of those boxes. Nova Scotia in general is a very university-rich area with regard to St. Francis Xavier, Dal University, St. Mary's. There's probably a dozen of them, so there's a real climate of highly skilled people. The port of Halifax, where most of the ships in the Canadian fleet are manufactured and sail out of, is obviously an anchor tenant and a source for a great deal of engineering and technical support. So there's a lot of infrastructure for the people that we need for this thing. And then, the icing on top, of course, is we're in Nova Scotia, right? We've got whales and we've got lobster and we've got the Halifax waterfront and we've got the some of the world-class golfing and salmon fishing in Cape Breton and the Cape Breton Highlands and all the things that are just a marvelous part of my living here now. I moved here 6 years ago. Is just icing on the cake for people that come here and visit and see what's going on with the space economy.
And so, besides the sort of, let's call them natural features and the logistics infrastructure you mentioned, and the lobsters, I definitely get the lobsters and all of that. What do you have to offer, or what do you feel like as a commercial spaceport you have to offer the people who will ultimately use it? And I must admit, I just don't know anything about it. Like, for example, a rocket company, a launch company, again, they will need things like a mission control center, like an integration facility, right, where the payload gets put into the fairing and all of this. Depending on what type of rockets they use, there's basically obviously some sort of propellant infrastructure, right? If it's
Yes.
liquid rockets, as most of our rockets are these days, then obviously that brings a certain level of complexity with it as well. What kind of infrastructure do you have to provide as the operator versus what maybe you expect that the ultimate users may just have to, I guess, maybe build themselves even?
Yeah, so the model we are operating under is a lease model, if you will, that provides facilities for our launch vehicle clients and their satellite clients. So yeah, the launch control center, a payload processing facility, another facility for satellites that before they get integrated into an upper stage that have to be tested and checked out, the propellant and gas interfaces, all those kinds of things are key for sure. But we also have the regulatory interface. Transport Canada is the regulatory body that we have the relationship with. Nav Canada takes care of the airspace. So we're providing that service that clears the air traffic, controls the public access, approves the launch, provides the propellants, provides the gases, the touch labor associated with it, et cetera. But I would also point out that the spaceports of the future, commercial spaceports, are much more compact. They are not like everybody knows Apollo and the space shuttle program and the massive facilities. And when I did my first launch and helping a company out in New Mexico 15 years ago, it was done in a little trailer that was a mile and a half from the launch pad. So it doesn't have to be these massive infrastructure pieces that are historically done. In fact, many of these launch vehicle developers are containerized. They are coming with 3 or 4 tractor trailers, and they need a laydown yard, and they need an area that is dedicated for them to do their stuff, but they can be fairly autonomous. So we want to be flexible and offer full services. Obviously, that's where the annual lease comes in. That's more robust, but we also have that flexibility to offer a less infrastructure for the client that doesn't need it. But at the end of the day, it's a bit of a jump ball because we're not going to build 10 pads. We're not going to build 5 pads. We're looking at 2 to 3 small launcher pads on the order of 1,000 kilogram capacity. That's the payload capacity to orbit. But we're qualified for 5,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. Which is in what's characterized as a medium class launcher. So ultimately, I can see 2, maybe 4 total launch pads on the site that we're servicing all these clients from, taking advantage of the 150 to 175 good launching days per year. And to me, that's the real we talked about all logistics, the whole adage of location, 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 slam dunk, right? But what is the other part? All these clients, these launch vehicle developers, how are they going to be successful? There's only one way. They have to launch often. And you can't launch often if they're launching once a week in Florida already, and you can't get a word in edgewise, let alone a launch. So the idea that we have this range of inclinations that we can service where all their satellite clients want to go in one spot, and we've got the open skies, if you will, that can support 10, 20, 30 launches per year without compromise, or more as the need may be, as the demand goes. That's the piece that I think the launch clients are really looking at closely, is how do their financial models work. If you're launching, say, 150 kilograms to orbit, and you're only launching 5 times a year, and you're only making $7 or $8 million per launch, and you've got this huge infrastructure that you paid for to develop your rocket and production and test capability and a standing army to do launch, how do you make that financial model work? How do you see profitability? Yes, they'll generate revenue, but are they profitable? I mean, there are companies out there that are doing well, but they're and generating revenue, but they're not profitable. What we really offer our clients is that place they can be profitable from.
And so the launch cadence, I mean, that's an interesting point you bring up there, right? I mean, and that's even more true, or, well, let me phrase it this way. That's even further improved if the launch providers are targeting, or at least eventually targeting, reusability, right? Because then, by definition, the more they launch, the more they sort of amortize the initial cost of whatever they're reusing. Is that something you will be catering to as well? Because I assume sort of reusability may introduce additional complications, right? If you suddenly have booster stages coming back to, somewhere near the launch site.
I mean, yes, that is potentially a complication in the first stage return, for example. But there is a lot of capability off the coast of Nova Scotia for other islands, or they've been doing LNG gas platforms for decades here, frankly, and they can be repurposed as a landing pad. So we don't have to worry about it. It's really about the sonic boom, I think, of the return entry. That is the thing that is the hardest to accommodate. But if you've got that off the coast, it's much less of an issue. So we certainly have some landing sites that have been identified off the coast and downrange that are acceptable to a number of these clients.
And so talking about sort of your potential clients, and I think you started answering it. So you are clearly looking at people who want to go to orbit, because I guess another type of client would be just people launching sounding rockets, right, and suborbital. But it sounds like you're looking to people that are going to orbit, size class, sort of like, that's the type of size class where many of these so-called current small launches fall in, something from a few hundred kilograms to sort of low single-digit metric tons payload to low Earth orbit.
Yeah, no, we did a suborbital launch last year, which was really intriguing for us. It was more just an exercise in training and exercising the pieces. So we had Nav Canada, Transport Canada. We hosted a launch vehicle from a student-led organization, and they came out, and that was very helpful for us because we had to go through almost all the exercises of an orbital launch for a suborbital launch, even a small one. But we also discovered along the way, oh yeah, there is actually a suborbital market out there. There's a lot of interest in this facility, especially because it's so close to the ocean, especially because of the geopolitical world we're living in right now with hypersonics, and there is a major demand for test and tracking, et cetera, of suborbital types of platforms that offers a whole new business segment for us. So that is something that we've seen some traction for. But ultimately, yes, it is about getting orbital satellite delivery for our launch clients and hosting them here and providing them the services they need, whether it's for their staff and hotels, or whether the infrastructure that comes with the launch control center and everything else we provide.
And your clients, just to make sure I understood this correctly before. Well, let me just ask you, so what is the business models? Your clients, launch companies, would they, for example, like permanently or like lease a pad for a certain time, or is it sort of like shared pad per launch, or how do people actually engage with you and
They're interested
provide you revenue?
They're interested in 10-year leases, that kind of thing, because they need that. There's some companies that are in the pipeline that have 25 missions pledged from one company, 30 from another, 10 from another, and they don't have a place they can do those. None of these launch vehicle clients, short of SpaceX or Boeing, have their own launch pads or their own capabilities to identify a site to do what they need to do. So it is having a multi-purpose pad is painful for everybody involved, right? Moving a new client in and a new client out. Yes, there are commonalities. Yes, they're typically RP1 kerosene, high purity kerosene, or liquid oxygen. There are a lot of commonalities in what we'd be able to provide to particular clients. But their flame trenches or their structures for the launch vehicle itself that they're paying for, those are pretty unique, and they want to be able to make that investment and have those in place to be able to use them as frequently as they can to encourage their profitability. And the other piece that comes along with it, though, is that the Canadian government, the provincial government, they've given us reimbursement programs that help these launch clients come in and get their infrastructure in place. As long as we're building it for them with Canadian hands and getting this infrastructure in place for them, they can actually see reductions in getting their facility, their portion of the facility started up. Then surrounding their launch pad site, of course, is where we come in and providing the additional services with payloads and launch control and propellant interfaces. We can bring in the propellants and working on those interfaces of who's responsible for what piece in that. But really, it's them getting that dedicated place that they know that they can launch from and meet their clients' needs. Because at the end of the day, this is not slowing down. I mean, I think the FCC had 24,000 plus satellites approved for launch over the next few years. I was at a conference last year, and one of the people with the FCC talked about having 50-something thousand additional applications for satellites. It's not slowing down, right? And so that demand is there. A number of these launch vehicles are not going to make it in the industry just because of the money and technical achievements that need to be met. But the ones that are going to be busy.
And so I can't help asking, so what if someone blows up their launch pad, which, let's face it, that could actually happen, right? Some of these companies are very
Absolutely.
young, it is actual rocket science, right?
Yes, it
As
is.
more
Yeah.
US more than most people appreciate. Is that something like you guys have insurance, or like you force the launch provider to have insurance, or what happens if someone blows up a
Yeah.
pad to smithereens?
So the launch vehicle company has a pretty complex insurance regime that they have to adhere to, because not only is it the launch vehicle and the launch site, but it's also the payloads, all the satellites. They're basically taking on the responsibility of launching somebody's satellites. That has to be named on their insurance as well. So we're named on the insurance by the launch client, for sure, and as is the satellite client. And there's kind of a path of when these insurance pieces kick in. Like the satellite comes onto the site, it's not on the launch vehicle client until it's been accepted by them and put in their cargo bay. Then suddenly they're responsible for the satellites. The launch vehicle they're responsible, for, and so we're named on the insurance at the end of the day.
Yeah, sure. And sort of expanding from that, so and also going beyond just the launch side, um, how does the sort of legal liability work here? I guess this is a launch site in Canada, so I assume on a national level, Canadian law grips and applies, right? Is there? I must admit, I'm not a space lawyer. Is there Canadian space law that's applicable here?
There is, yes, indeed, and there is existing regulations that have been in place for many decades. They used to do suborbital launches from Churchill, Manitoba, many decades ago. The Black Brant, for example. So there is regulations already in place that cover the launch site requirements and everything else, and includes the insurance regime and the liability, with respect to how the government of Canada plays a role in that. So that is in place as well. And in fact, if you think about it, the whole industry has gone from government launches to commercial launches, but it was governments that signed the international treaties back in the 60s and 70s, et cetera, of space exploration and safe exploration of space, et cetera. So it's kind of a transition point for the globe, in the sense that all these government treaties I have to live by and honor as well, clearly, and they have a role in reviewing the payloads that are going to go on board and accepting the liabilities that come along with that as well. I have, the communications, the FCC, what band you're broadcasting on, et cetera. All those things are part of an international regime.
And so I appreciate you're also not a lawyer, but so from what you've seen, the Canadian, the applicable laws here, because I seem to remember from some discussions I've had, like sometimes these laws have, for example, provisions on liability caps, right? Because let's face it, you could have a rocket launch and maybe something really horrible happens where, your first stage falls down and destroys a number of properties or even kills people. Is there sort of anything like liability caps or other sort of interesting provisions of the Canadian regulatory regime that spring to mind?
They're following and mapping to the same ones in the U.S. under the FAA, Commercial Space Transportation Office, I think, and there are caps involved associated with that.
Okay.
But there's also such the my engineering hat goes on, right? And you have to look at the probability and the severity, and you do those analyses and figuring out how you can mitigate those. And with the advent of the autonomous flight safety systems, for example, that keep the rockets tight to a trajectory, you're not depending on a human in the loop to make an assessment whether it's going the right way. You really have to look at it from the engineering controls as well, and that potential likelihood of somebody on the ground getting hurt. That's the beauty of this location, I
Mhm.
think, more so than most of the others that are out there, is that it is nothing but ocean, for thousands and thousands of kilometers. We're 500 meters from the ocean's edge.
No, I appreciate that. No, actually, now that you mentioned the ocean again and the advantages of that, I realized I should have asked you a question before when we were talking about the real estate aspect. The, have you guys looked at, some people in the past have proposed sea launch, right? Just kind of leaving a country aside and just go straight and have a platform, right? And it seems like the Chinese are kind of partially going back to that. Is that something you guys looked at?
Well, our initial launch client that we have been working with for a number of years was based in Ukraine, is based in Ukraine still. We're not really able to move forward with them at this point. But the Cyclone 4M was the initial vehicle we were planning here before we transitioned over to this lease
Mm,
model. They did sea launch. They were providing the vehicle to the joint venture between Boeing and Russia. Ukraine, Yuzhnoye and Yuzhmash were providing the launch vehicle for sea launch. Um, it's logistics heavy. It didn't work out. I mean, there's turning that model into something that can be, financially viable. At the outset, yes, going out into the ocean and away from people and launching, that all makes perfect sense, right? I mean, the same thing with captive carry vehicles that can fly out over the ocean and drop their payloads to ignite and go into orbit, all makes perfect sense. But when you start looking at the cost of the logistics, the personnel, the time it takes to get out there, are you autonomous completely? Getting the satellites into position, there's so many aspects of it. It's just not simply the trajectory. It's just not simply there's all sorts of aspects to the cost of this thing. So that did not work. In my experience, the sea launch platform that Boeing and Russia JV'd on was not successful. I just don't think they can make the monetary aspects of that work out. Similarly, with captive carry, it's sort of the same thing. So it would have to be significantly streamlined and done significantly different than has been done in the past. If you're a government, as in China, where you're not worried about a bottom line, that's a different story. But doing it from a commercial perspective is a completely different animal.
understood. So staying with that business aspect a little bit, let's talk business development. So how do you guys go about this, like attracting customers to your launch site? And to the extent you can already talk about it, maybe like, if you can disclose who you're talking to, who may be users of the launch site?
Um, so we have an MOU. We started with a letter of intent. Collaboratively work together, see how we can build this thing together, what your needs are, what our service offerings are. That follows with an MOU, which really defines the details of who's building what, who's paying for what, et cetera. So it's, as much as they're assessing me and our spaceport and what we have to offer, I'm assessing them. Frankly, what is their opportunity potential for success? Where are they in their development process? Do they have flight heritage under their belt? Are they a large enough rocket that I can see them being profitable at the end of the day? If they're launching
Yeah.
50 kilograms to orbit, I don't really want to try to take that on because it's not really going to be profitable for them or for us at the end of the day. So there's a two-part dance there of what we have to offer and what they have to offer as well. And are they financially backed enough to really make it where they're going to go? Because as you
Yeah.
pointed out, this is rocket science and bad days can happen, right? So we want to make sure that we're leaning into the rockets that have heritage, if possible. But we're not a test facility. We are truly wanting to do launches with mature technology. So yes, we've got a couple of agreements with European customers. We've got one with a Canadian and one with a US client at this point. And all of us are working together to collaboratively bring their vehicles to our site. And which one ends up at the one or two pads that we're going to lease is sort of TBD on both behalves. You know, their plans, their timetables, and their technology advancements, their TRL level, et cetera, matters as much to us as well. Because I don't want to build it and they will come, field of dreams either, right? So it is a harmonized approach that I think is set up to help the client that understands what they're getting into and understands what they need to do to be profitable, to really then take that next step with us.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate what you're saying there. Also, in my main role as a space venture capitalist, right? Because I mean, obviously, this is a high risk business, and we've already seen examples of certain spaceport in the UK betting on a certain air launch company that clearly didn't work out.
Yep.
I guess a certain spaceport in Alaska was betting on a certain company that, well, maybe it's working out again now. They just got a big contract yesterday, but it's a risky business, so you probably want to have several irons in the fire there, I guess.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And so, speaking of status, though, so I mean, so that's the status with the customers. Can you give us a bit more information, sort of overall status, sort of where you guys on developing the spaceport? What are sort of the next major milestones? When maybe see a first orbital launch, best guess, and then ideally, where do you see the whole thing in, I don't know, like 10 years time or so?
Oh, yeah. So we, of course, have the 335 acres under a 40-year lease. So we've done the initial roads out to the launch pad area and the integration facility area, and are really positioned now to start tailoring some of the design for these launch clients. We've got a separate parcel of land for our launch control center, for our ground station activities that are actually under construction right now. There's some ground station work that is being put in place. So it's really about getting some of those services in place to be able to do those launches, launch tracking, et cetera. There's a Canadian company, Reaction Dynamics. They're based in Montreal. They've got some really cool tech that they're have matured and done some full duration burns on. We're looking at doing a Kármán line, above a Kármán line launch next year with them next summer. And an orbital launch is quickly after that as they can get there. So it's really a crawl, walk, run for them and for us in that one. There are other launch clients that are more keen to get orbitals. 2026 is when I'd say we're going to see some significant orbital launches happening from the facility, and tailoring what we're offering our lease clients over the next 18 months is really going to be key to that.
Gotcha. And so the other thing I was curious about from a business point of view is, so at the end of the day, what you're doing here is infrastructure, right? And so if you look at other types of infrastructure in the world, like we can even stay within, sort of aerospace, like airports, right? Which of course is extremely mature, right? They get financed in a certain way because they're so predictable and people actually like it. Basically, a lot of debt on it because the revenue is so predictable. We're obviously, for various reasons, very far away from that still on the spaceport side, even though I hope we will get there to sort of very regular, stable operations. But for the moment, how do you finance the spaceport? Is it just equity plus some government help, or how does that work?
Yeah, a combination equity, debt, and government help. Yes, we've we've had private investment of over $20 million to date to get us to this point, and we've got the government, Canada, the government of the province of Nova Scotia that have pledged 30 or $40 million in reimbursement programs. We've got debt lenders and equity lenders that are finalizing their pieces now to really kick off this next major phase of construction, and then it's off to the races.
Gotcha. And so if you kind of zoom out from just maritime launch services to the sort of, I don't know, let's call it the global spaceport sector in, some reasonable time in the future, 15, 20 years time, what do you think this may all look like?
Well, the engineer rocket geek in me says we can't get it to a point anytime in the not too distant future where it's safe enough to overfly population centers first and foremost, right? So you need to find places where you can launch from that have safety zones down range, that have ability to drop stages or return stages. At the end of the day, not all of them are going to return if you have a bad day as well. So you have to have that in the planning. And then you look at the globe and where there are places that people can build these, and there are a number of developments that are underway in Europe, but bluntly put, that are on the wrong side of the pond. They can launch in one direction and one direction only. I'm not sure the clients, the countries downrange of that are going to be keen. But there are the point is that there's not a ton of places around the globe to be able to do orbital launches from, because people like to live on the coast. That's where they build their homes, right? So we've been approached by a number of entities, 3 separate ones over the last couple of years, wanting us to replicate what we're doing in their locations. And I've had to help them understand their locations that as just don't work at the end of the day. They, whether it's, I'm going to drop a stage over some part of a country that's desert, so it's perfect. No, dropping stages on land is not preferred. Overflying population centers is not preferred. Having a very, very limited range of inclinations is not preferred. Being too far from the equator is not preferred if you're doing an equatorial launch, not being etc. So there's this whole there's a lot of there's a lot of heady interest. Spaceports are cool. Let's look at the ones in the US. There's a dozen or more licensed spaceports: New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, Oklahoma, California, a couple in Texas, but none of them can do orbital launches, because of the population centers and stuff like that. So there's going to be kind of a realignment, my assessment, of the viability of some of these sites. There is, and then the logistics of getting to some of these places, whether it's in a jungle in South America or stuff like that. It's going to be hard to really match the safety technical requirements with the logistics, with the site, with the range of inclinations that clients want. When you start crossing those, you put those in a box and start checking all the boxes, we're kind of unique. we got a sweet spot here in Canada, and replicating this other places, they're going to try, but then they become stuck on a government, the government's paying for it, right? Or whatever it is. So, but where does our industry need to go? At the end of the day, we've got commercial rockets, commercial satellites, OTVs, or orbital transfer vehicles, ways to deliver things to the moon, but they're all using government ranges. Clearly, we've got to move away from government ranges to build a true vertical that includes the range, the vehicle, the satellites, the transfers, the space stations in orbit, that builds that entire vertical. Finding those places are going to be pretty hard, and that's something I think is pretty unique about what we're offering. Frankly, on the 45th parallel, which is where many of these new space stations are planned, is hard to do. So where's the market going to go? There are true limitations when an engineer or from a perspective of actually looking at the viability of sites. until we break through new technology and propulsion, a la Star Trek, right? Until we really break through some technology level beyond what Werner von Braun did with V2 rockets, we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, a question kind of targeting the new technologies. But before we get to those sort of our final questions, is there anything else that we should have talked about with respect to maritime launch services that we haven't and that you'd like to highlight?
Uh, the overall support is really where I think we started this thing right. You know, working with the community, working with the municipality, working with the First Nations community, the Bakankek, the Mi'kmaq here in the province, then working with the provincial government and the federal government. Building that social license is key. You know, when you're building a rocket or a satellite, you've got a facility, you're doing it somewhere, they don't even know what's going on inside the fence. When you're launching a rocket, it's land based. You have a community around you, and I think that's one of the things that has really been probably the most important thing that we are able to achieve, is really having that social license and the support from the community all the way up to the federal government to really bring this to bear. And you really can't get around that because we have neighbors, and they care about what's going on in their backyard. But I've been really pleased with the social license that we've built and the interest that we have from the community, not just for jobs. We had independent assessment done, polling done, and jobs are really important for people. The economic impact from this thing, a rural part of Canada having a space hub, not in a major metropolitan area, is a game changer for Nova Scotia. It's a game changer for Canada to be a part of this new market, this space economy that's happening. But at the end of the day, none of that is possible without that social license.
Yeah, no, agreed. And is I think it's also quite exciting for the people who live there to have rocket launches going
A
on.
lot of people want to come watch a rocket launch. Yeah.
I think so personally. But so
Yeah.
coming back to, sorry, not coming back to, coming to this two final questions we always ask. So one is, since you are a self-proclaimed space and rocket geek, as you've pointed out several times, besides the spaceport business you're currently engaging in, what else are you watching? What else is interesting in the space sector right now? And it could be things like you mentioned before, like maybe new propulsion technologies, but it can be broader than that. Anything you are watching with interest?
Oh, I'm really excited about where we're going as an industry with Lunar Gateway and the deeper space stuff that is on the horizon for us. So I think that's really an important part of where we have to do from as humans and responsible for looking outward. I had a bunch of kids in a classroom, and we talked about satellites and what satellites do and what services they provide. And when some of them are looking out into the deep space of the cosmos, or looking in and measuring the greenhouse gases on Earth, or monitoring our environment. And I had these little stickers at the end of the thing that they could go put on the refrigerators that peel off. One was of a nebula, one was from the old Hubble telescope photos, and one was of the Earth. And it was really interesting to me that 2 to 1, all these kids were interested in looking out and understanding what the cosmos is and what's going out there. So I think this is important, the low Earth orbit that we're taking over, if you will, from the government, and how we handle that commercially and respectfully from an environmental change and maintenance of it. But then it's beyond that. It's looking into the deeper space and opportunities that are out there.
Terrific. And deeper space is a perfect segue to our traditional final question, which is about science fiction. Steve, are you a science fiction fan? And if so, what are some of your
Oh yeah.
favorites?
Well, I mean, all the Star Trek stuff, of course, but any writing on that stuff is always intriguing to me. Definitely interested in the space geek stuff. The deep
Good stuff.
space and some of those movies and everything else. Pretty exciting.
Great. Steve, well, thank you so much for being on today, and best of luck for Maritime Launch Services, and looking forward to your first launch.
Thank you. Look forward to it as well. And you're invited. We'll stay in touch, please.
I may take you up on that. Thanks.
And that's a wrap for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. Once more, if you enjoyed this, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. You can support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an interesting space story to tell, or are interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. See you for the next episode.